All right. Hey, yo, salute to all my subscribers. And a special shout out to everybody else passing through. YouTube, what's good? All right. So I wanted to touch on this platform for a little while now. Um, I came across an article not too long ago. And the article, the person in the article was basically touching on their different approach and their different style to parenting. And in the article, along with them talking about what their parenting style was, how they how they approached parenting with their children, um they alluded to there being four popular or well-known or four overall categories or styles of parenting. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm going to actually read what the four different styles, as far as this article is concerned, the four different styles of parenting. They have it listed at as authoritarian or disciplinarian, permissive or indulgent, uninvolved, and authoritative. Now, I'm sure, just by thinking about it for a second, you can all figure out what these different styles might entail, or what some of the different approaches you would take with each of these individual styles. But what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to read what it says for each of these, because they have a breakdown. So um, for the authoritarian style of parenting, they have it here that authoritarian parents are often thought of as disciplinarians. And then the bullet points they have listed here is they use a strict discipline style with little negotiation. Uh, um, Punishment is common. Communication is mostly one way from parent to child. Rules usually are not explained. Parents with this style are typically less nurturing. And then it says expectations are high with limited flexibility. So that's how they sum up the authoritarian style of parenting. And then they have right under that permissive parenting. And it says permissive or indulgent parents mostly let their children do what they want, and often with limited guidance or direction. They are more like friends than parents. And the bullet points they have listed here are as follows. Their discipline style is the opposite of strict. They have limited or no rules and mostly let children figure problems out on their own. Communication is open, but these parents let children decide for themselves rather than giving direction. Parents in this category tend to be warm and nurturing, and then expectations are typically minimal or not set by these parents. And that one's interesting as well. And then it says for uninvolved parenting, it says uninvolved parents give children lots of freedom and generally stay out of their way. Some parents may make a conscious decision to parent in this way, while others are less interested in parenting or unsure what to do. And the bullet points they have here are no particular discipline style is utilized. An uninvolved parent lets a child mostly do what he or she wants, probably out of a lack of information or caring. Communication is limited. This group of parents offer a little nurturing, and there are few or no exceptions or expectations of children. And the last and final style they have here is authoritative, which they break down as authoritative parents are reasonable and nurturing and set high, clear expectations. Children with parents who demonstrate this style tend to be self disciplined and think for themselves. This style is thought to be most beneficial to children. And then the bullet points they have here disciplinary rules are clear, um, and the reasons behind them are explained. Communication is frequent and appropriate to the children. A level of understanding. Authoritative parents are nurturing. Expectations and goals are high, but stated clearly. The children may have input into goals. Um, I don't, I don't right off the bat or on the surface necessarily have an issue with the four styles of parenting that are mentioned in this article. I don't even necessarily have an issue with how these different styles or categories of parents are broken down. What I will say though is this: there's an almost infinite number of approaches to how you can choose to parent your children, right? And usually, no matter how many different styles you say there are to parenting, usually parents will parent their child in one of two ways. Aside from the different categories here, right? The choice that parents usually make in how they parent their children will typically either be exactly the same way that they were raised or exactly the opposite. And very few parents, I believe, very rare number of parents see the value in both and will try to meet somewhere in the middle. But usually, like with anything in life, people are extreme. And you either hated the way that your parents raised you so much that you completely rebel from it and you raise your kids completely the opposite, or you see the value in how your parents raised you so much that you raise your kids exactly the same. There are even parents who totally disagreed with how they were raised as children, and somehow they end up raising their children the exact same way. So you usually will find, in my opinion, most parents to be on one side or the other of the spectrum. And it's always interesting to me, which parents and which upbringings influence those parents as to where they fall on that spectrum. But my approach, and this article is good. It's not a bad article. I think I think parenting, not just the style of parenting, but where your children are being raised plays a part as well, right? Because I think parenting has to be. I think there should really to me there's really only one style of parenting that is the best style, and that is an adaptive one. And there are a bunch of reasons why I say that, right? So I have three children that I'm raising, two of my own, one a stepchild, right? And I come from a pretty large family. I have six other siblings, so I have seen the gamut, the full spectrum of how children can be raised. I have seen, through my own upbringing, and then even in my household now, having three separate children with three different personalities, you can have 20 kids. Each of those children are going to have their own personalities. They're going to be individuals in their own way. There is no set style of parenting that if you just have one child, you should not be one set style. You shouldn't just be an authoritative parent. You shouldn't just be an uninvolved parent. You shouldn't just be a disciplinarian. You have to be able to adapt to each of these different styles at different times, depending one where your child is in their development, their age group, their mental capacity. All those things have to play. All those things have to, come into that whole equation. And then if you have different children, you have to take a different approach to each of those children based on their personality. Because, see, I don't agree with the fact that just because I won't even say agree, because I don't know that people necessarily feel this way, but I'm putting it out there that from what I have seen in my observations, the more children you have, the more different, the more chameleon like as a parent you want to be or you need to be. Because you I say this all the time, and most people don't understand it. Equal does not mean the same. That's what I think so many people don't realize. I talk about this in relationships. The same thing applies in parenting. Equal does not mean the same. If you have a son versus and a daughter, how you raise your son will have sudden nuanced and differences from how you raise your daughter, and so it should, because you're raising two children, molding two young minds into one day being grown adults, both at opposite ends of the gender spectrum, who both have roles to play in society and both have ways that they should carry themselves in society. So you can't raise them the same. And even if you have multiple boys and no girls, or multiple girls and no boys, you're still going to need to be able to adapt your style different ways for each of those children. And then on different days and in different situations. And then as they develop, you need to be able to adapt those styles even more. Like there are times when you're going to need to be more of a dictator style parent. And there are days when you're going to need to be a little more uninvolved. And there are days when you're going to need to be nurturing. And there are days when you're going to need to be a little more of a stickler when it comes to certain things. And that's just the best way, in my opinion, to have the most well-rounded child. And then you have to account for this too. You know, when it comes to my three, my son, I have one son, right? My son is 9 years old. I know that my son needs a different approach than his two sisters. So how I interact with my son, and when it's time to be, that disciplinarian when it comes to him, that looks completely different for him than it would for his younger sister, who's only 7. Because if I say something to him about something I see him doing in that moment, he's more inclined right then and there, as I'm saying what I'm saying, to stop what he's doing and change direction. Just because he understands when I say something, I'm not really for play like that, right? It's what I say, and I joke around a lot with my kids. I play around a lot with them. It's a big fun fest. But then I'm the kind of person, when it's time to knock that shit off, I'm not really for play. My son understands that, and he'll kind of go, what I'm saying, a whole different direction, and there's really no need for extra correction. Now, with my 7-year-old, she's a whole different she's a whole different animal, like a whole different animal. Now, I would say that I'm the parent that she is probably listens to quicker as far as results. Like if I say do something, she will probably do it a lot faster and without like verbally expressing her having issues with it, or without, acting out or throwing some kind of a little mini tantrum. She'll exhibit that less with me than she will with her mom. But I noticed though, when there are certain times, like if she's being whiny or bratty, or she's terrorizing her brother or her sister, and then I say something, like I tell her to stop or I tell her to knock it off or whatever, she'll keep going. Like she'll keep going at a slightly lower tone, because she's so used to not having me be so strict with her, because I'm a lot less strict with her. One, because she is my only girl, like my only flesh and blood girl, right? And she's my baby. She's the youngest, and she's the last child I will ever have on the face of this earth, thank God. Um, because I'm done. And because she knows that I favor her. And as a side note, any parent who says shit like, "Oh, you're not supposed to have a favorite child. You can't have a favorite child," you're full of shit and you're lying to yourself. Now, I don't care if you keep that shit to yourself and only you know that you have a favorite child, but let's be real. All parents, if you have multiple kids and you have gone through the stress and the headaches of raising those children, right? I don't care what age they are. I don't care if one of them's 2 months and the oldest is 20, you have a favorite child. You may not admit the shit out loud, and you're not going to tell your kids that. I don't give a fuck. I will, but you may not, and that's fine. Whatever works for you. But we all, if we all of us who have multiple children, we all have a child out of those children that we favor a little bit more than the other ones, and that's just, it is what it is. Period. If you say that's not the case, then you're not being honest. You're not human. That's human to just favor a child over the other, or if you have multiple kids, you favor, because it's about behavior, right? And of course, you're going to favor the child who listens to you more. You're going to favor the child more who gets the message that you're trying to instill and portray to them. Like you're just going to, because there are certain kids, if you have multiple kids, that are just smoother to deal with than the other, even if just slightly. So that was just a side note, right? So now, and this goes into the different styles that I was talking about, and how you have to adapt them, as you move through that parenting spectrum for your children, from one age and stage of life into the next, right? So my youngest, she knows that she's a daddy's girl, right? And she knows it 100%. But because she knows that, and because of how much I babied her, and because of how much I nurture her, um, she it's not about disrespect. She's just so used to not really being in trouble with me that she is not really much in the way to think about as far as consequences. Whereas my son knows full well I don't play that shit. You know what I'm saying? You do something I don't rock with. This is what time it is. But he knows that already. You see, I got a little bit softer when my daughter was born. Again, one, because she's the only daughter I've ever had from me, and she's the youngest, and she's my baby, and she's the last one. So I got, for people who don't, understand this, for men at least, I can speak for men. It's one thing to be a stepfather, right? Where you learn, and I'm all over the place with this, but it's the first one. I'm feeling out what I want to do with it, so just roll with me. Um, when you become a step parent, it's a whole different process because you're learning how to love someone else's child as your own. But it's different when you've had your own and then you become a step parent too, or a blended family later in life. Whereas the first time I became a parent was me becoming a step parent long before I had my own. So I learned how to parent being a step parent, right? And growing up in a household where two of my siblings and myself had the same father who was in the home at that time. And the rest of our siblings, they were being raised by our father, their stepfather. So I had already seen what that dynamic looks like. I had already seen, what different things go and what different things don't. Okay. So it's one thing to learn parenting from the standpoint of being a step parent and then to have your own. And then as a man, when you have a son, it's a different, it's like an extension of yourself, but you also understand, for any man, you understand that when you're raising a son, you're raising not only the next you, but a better you. And you're raising someone who has to grow into being a man in today's society. And also, what has to be taken into account for any black man who has a son, because now you're raising a black son into being a black man in America. There's a whole different level of pressure, and there's a whole different level of stress that comes along with that. So I only have so much wiggle room when it comes to my son. I have to be harder on him. I have to be hard on him for several reasons. One, because he's going to grow up and be a black man in this country. And the way things are now, it doesn't look like they're going to be that much better when he comes into his adulthood. Two, I'm not going to be here forever. And he knows this. And whether I'm around or not, he is responsible for looking out for his sisters. I don't care that one is older and one is younger. That's his responsibility as far as I'm concerned. So when I before I leave here, my job as a parent, my number one job as a parent before I leave this earth is to make sure that my children, whatever age they are, when I leave this earth, that they are fully capable to go out into the world and survive and have the tools that they need to be survivors. Because in being a survivor, you can figure everything else out. You can figure out how to be successful. You can figure out how to be financially stable. You can figure out how to deal with and interact in your adult relationships because you know how to be a survivor. And those are the things that is my responsibility to teach them. And with my son, and with him being a black boy in America, and before you know it, time's going to go by so quick, and he's going to be a black man in America. He's going to have a lot of pressure against him. And with all that's going on now, if something doesn't change drastically and soon, any wrong step that he makes, even in situations where he doesn't necessarily make a wrong step, and he can just be driving down the street and get pulled over and have an issue with a police officer who probably shouldn't be a police officer. So I have to be hard on him. He has to fully understand the consequences for his actions. Even now, when those consequences or those actions might not be the most serious, that has to be instilled in him now because he's going to be required to live that out, to be that example. And he's a direct reflection of me because the men who raise their sons are responsible for growing those sons into men. Because despite popular opinion, despite how many people beg to differ, and despite how many women do it as single mothers because they have no choice, it's a different thing. Those women are survivors. Those women who have no choice but to raise their sons alone, they have no choice but to raise them into men. But in the most ideal situation, and in the most traditional sense, it takes a man to raise a man. And then that's just, it just is what it is. In order for my son to have the most manly qualities instilled into him, there's no better person for that to come from than me. And if for some reason I'm not around, if if I leave this earth, whatever the case, absent of him having some kind of a male figure in his life, there's going to be something somewhere missing. It just is what it is. Because that's just, a man learns best on how to be a man and what qualities they should possess and when to do what, and how to approach certain situations. They learn those qualities best from men. Regardless of if you single mothers agree with it or not, some way, shape, or form, even your sons who you are raising as single mothers, they're learning a lot of their characteristics from men. Now, it could be the positive male role model figures in their lives, or it could be the men in the songs that they listen to, or the men on the street corners that they see, or in the movies that they watch. But trust me, the different mannerisms that a man has, the different characteristics that a man has, the way a man carries himself, that can only be passed down to a man from another man. And maybe that could be a large part of the reason why so many men, and I'm not talking about homosexual men, I'm talking about heterosexual men who don't have that man feel, who don't have that man presence. They probably didn't have that male role model or that male figure, because that can only come from another man. But I'm not here to argue that. So back to what I was saying. So when it comes to my son, I'm a lot harder on him than I am on the girls. And he has more responsibility. It may not be fair, but it's life. And so because of that, my youngest, she believes that she can get away with things even in situations where I'm directly confronting her with something that she's doing. But now here's the thing, and she's learning this very quickly. When it's time to be serious, and when it's time for me to correct you on something, and there to be discipline in a situation, there is no such thing as favorites. I don't play that shit, because there are very real consequences if I don't stop that shit now while my children are still young. Because when they get into their teenage years, it's too late at that point. So the fact that I'm recognizing kind of the monster I've created in my 7-year old, I'm adapting my parenting style when it comes to her in certain situations, so that she knows, yeah, I love you. You can get the world from me. You are my world, but at the same time, I don't play that shit. And when it comes time for you to do what I'm telling you to do, there's a little room there for you to mix that shit up. Because here's what happens. So as your children get older, your parenting style has to change. For my son, him being 9 years old and my youngest being 7, up till now, it's pretty much been what I say goes. There's no room for communication. There's no room for discussion. There is nothing to talk about. You have to be a dictarian. You have to be. You have to be a dictator, because your children, before they reach a level of mental capacity where they can truly understand what their actions are and what the consequences are, you have to make all those decisions, because you're directly responsible for the outcome of whatever happens. And so it is like a mindless following at that point. Now, my son, I shouldn't say my son, my 12-year-old was coming into the age now where she's getting more responsibilities. So more decisions are able to be made by her. She's expected at this age now to start figuring things out for herself within reason of what her age is and what her level of understanding and maturity is. And my son, who's 9 years old and just started fourth grade earlier this year, um, who now has a key to the house, who is now able to walk up the street, to the bus stop for school in the morning, who's responsible now for locking the door, um, all these things. And while I'm sitting right here, while he's doing that, You're responsible for doing that. I'm not going to come lock the door. You do it. You figure it out. You figure out what time, your time management, and make sure you have all your stuff ready so that you're ready to walk out the door at 7:50 in the morning or whatever time it is that you have to leave to get on the bus. This is where I start to mold into him responsibility, accountability, time management, and all these different things. Because as he gets closer to what his sister's age is, I won't say shit. So when it comes to her at, she'll be 13 next month, there's no, I don't tell her what time to go to bed. I don't tell her what time to wake up. I don't tell her, you know what I'm saying? Like, you are now responsible for all of those things. She has a key. She walks to and from school. You need to figure out what time you need to leave to get to school on time. You need to figure out, you know what I'm saying? All of these different things that she's now responsible for, her chores. I am at a point now with her where I'm tired of telling you every day when to do your chores, when to do this, when to do that. You know that you have to do something when you come home from school. You get that shit done. You figure out what you're gonna have for, like, lunch or early dinner. Before the family has dinner, you figure that out for yourself. You prepare that for yourself. She's able to use the stove. She's able to do all these different things that the younger two are not yet, because they're not in that place. But if I wasn't able to adapt to these different types of parenting needs, I wouldn't be able to jump in and out of those different styles. But it's necessary, it's required, because it's not just about different children in different age groups and different personalities. It's also knowing about, what your kids are capable of as well. Like, the youngest, she's upset because she doesn't get a key, because she doesn't yet understand that, one, you don't have a need for it now, and two, you're still young, too young to, and you don't have the need for any of that. You know what I'm saying? So it's a whole different dynamic with her. With the older one, she starts school earlier before the younger two. Um, she likes to walk to school with her friends. If she wants a ride, she'll ask my wife for a ride. If she, if it's too cold or whatever. But most of the days, she just walks. She walks with her friends. It is what it is. I don't interfere with any of that. There's no need to. Now, when there's time for correction, course change, when there's time for, me to step in, or her, my wife to step in, then we do that as parents. But for the most part, by the age that she is now, the majority of the things that she has to handle at 12, 13, she is fully equipped and expected by us to handle those things. So my point is, as your children get older, you have to switch from that dictator, that disciplinarian, that authoritarian, into more of a guidance role, right? It's like, these are the things you should be doing. Hey, you got this. Is this right? Make sure this is good. It is what it is. And then as they get older and older, that role further diminishes down into, eventually your children are adept enough and self proficient enough for you to just be a mentor and to just be that advice, right? I'm never going to be my kids' friends. I'm never going to be their best friend. That's not my job as a parent, ever. My job as a parent is to be a parent, and that job and the functions of that job change at different stages in their life, and that's just the way that it is. Um, and there's no parenting style that's going to ever necessarily be better or worse than the other. It's all about timing. It's about making mistakes, but again, it's about recognizing those mistakes. There are parents out there who would see kind of the monster that I've turned my 7-year-old into. They would see that, but not know how to stop it or let it continue. I don't play that shit. I have to adapt. I'm seeing that the way that I was with her is kind of, it's creating a little more bad than I wanted or that I intended. And so, okay, now I got to pull back on that a little bit. Now we got to tighten up a little bit, because I don't, one thing I will never tolerate as a person, and definitely as a parent, is disrespect from my children. When they are out into the world, they're a reflection of who I am. Whatever issues, I may have had growing up with my siblings or my parents, or whatever I didn't agree with, or whatever I talked back on, or whatever issues existed. When I was out in the world, there's not a single person I've ever come across in my life who couldn't say that the reflection I was of my upbringing, how I was raised, those values, nobody could say that they were absent. You see what I'm saying? So it's always been clear through my through how I've carried myself in the real world that my upbringing, that I had one, right? That I had home training, that I had manners instilled into me, that I knew, right from wrong, good and evil, and all that shit. Of course, when you're young, you may make some mistakes and do certain things you shouldn't. Of course, that goes without saying for any of us. But one thing I want for my children to always exhibit when they're out in the world is that the reflection that you portray is a direct reflection on me. And anybody who sees you, interacts with you, better know that you, one, come from a home where you have two parents, which is rare nowadays, too rare, more rare than it should be. That you have a father in your life who's there every day, and that you're being raised right. If you're exhibiting those things, then whatever else is going on, whatever else happens, we deal with it. We work it out as those problems arise. But the second that you stop being that reflection of me, now we have an issue, and now it's time for drastic measures. And that's just how I approach parenting with my children. Um, this this article here, what is this? I don't even remember where I came across this article. How how I what my thoughts are on these different parenting styles and types. I think they could all work individually, depending on how you apply them, and what type of child you have. Because I think that there's a type of child that each of these parenting styles on their own would work for. But I'm just saying, I think that the most balanced parent, the most balanced children are the ones in which they're being raised by parents who understand that you're going to need each of these styles at some point to raise that child or those children, because it's a constant evolution. It's a constant change. And 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 why I said why environment matters. If you're raising a child in middle America, in suburbia, right, in rural America, you can take a slightly different approach than when you're raising a child in the inner cities that I lived in growing up, the inner cities that I'm from. Even with my children, they're not from a Patterson, New Jersey, or they didn't grow up in Broadway. They didn't grow up in some of these rough cities where, you know, um, there were dangerous elements. I mean, there are dangerous elements out in the world, just being a kid today in general, but where they're being raised, the city and the town that they're being raised is nothing like a Patterson, New Jersey, right? It's not like a Rahway, New Jersey. That element is not there. There are other elements, and just with the times that we live in, coming up in the '80s, it's a lot different than coming up in 2018. Shit's a lot different. So it's the time period, it's the environment. There's a lot of things that factor in. And I'm actually glad that I consider myself a new age parent, because my approach to parenting, I mean, I communicate with my children. They have input in a lot of things, and I'm not as strict with them now as I used to be. And I'm not as strict in certain situations as I have to be in other situations, because you cannot be a set way. And I think that was a big part of the reason why I didn't see eye to eye with my parents growing up, is because it was just one way, and that was it. And there was no give, and there was really no communication. The communication was one way. And their belief was, like most parents from their generation, the parent is right and the child is wrong. I don't take that approach. I don't agree with that. I never have. So I'm not going to then turn around and say whatever I say is right and my children are always wrong. They're going to be wrong more than they're right. But also, as a parent, I think it's important that you allow your children to sometimes live out their ideas, live out them being wrong in a controlled environment where you can kind of make sure nothing goes too bad. But the best teacher is life, the best teacher is experience. I can tell you all day long, not to touch the stove because you're not old enough, you're not ready, you don't know how it's hot, it will burn you. Or I can let you touch that motherfucker one time and then you will know instinctively for the rest of your life how hot that shit is. Because some people learn from most people, vast majority of people learn from their mistakes. Smart people will always learn from their mistakes, but people who are wise will learn from the mistakes of others. So I have to know as a parent when to let my children learn and fall because of their mistakes, with the hopes of me being able to show them through those teachings and examples to one day be wise enough to not even have to make those mistakes. Sometimes you have to allow them that leeway, though. I think the parents who don't, because they're so afraid or they shelter their kids so much that they don't want them to experience anything, they don't want them to be exposed to anything, that they're doing a disservice to their children. And I'll talk about that in a separate blog at another point. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on these different parenting styles. um Interested to know, right, which category of parent or which style do you feel like you belong in? Like which approach do you take to raising your children? Are you more of a, as this article put it, are you more of an authoritarian or disciplinarian where it's just listen, what I say goes, it is what it is. I don't give a fuck what your input is. I'm the parent, you're the child. That's it. Or are you more of a permissive or indulgent parent where you allow your kids to do more than maybe the average kid, or you allow them to have a lot of freedom, both in the home and outside the home? Because I spoil my kids. I mean, anything that's within my power, I have no problem with them having. I have no problem with letting them do shit that maybe some other parents would look at me like, you let your kids do that shit? Because I know how strict I can be. And I know in certain situations I have to be super strict. And there's such a thing as being too strict all the time to where there's resentment after a while, and then you start to lose respect. But I my being super strict is when I need to be, and I think that that's offset well with me being super indulgent as well. Because there's no reason to be I'm not a fucking CO. I'm not a fucking prison guard. You know what I'm saying? There are times when I have to take that approach, and those times don't last as long, and those times are very few and far in between. Um, and then, as far as uninvolved goes, the article, the way it sounds crazy, but it doesn't mean like you just are I don't give a shit parent, you're just not involved. No, it just means in certain situations, right, I just take an approach of, okay, I'm gonna step back, let me see if they know what they're supposed to do here. And that's necessary. That's like taking the training wheels off of a bike for the first time, and then staying close enough that if shit goes left, you're there, but also just seeing if they're able to keep that balance on their own, and seeing if they're able to kind of stay afloat, because at some point it's sink or swim. And you cannot, if you have a child who is in full possession of their faculties, right, they're not disabled. I don't even know what the politically correct way to say that is, but if they're not disabled, or if they don't have, they're not autistic or something like that, where they're low functioning, where you have to literally be stuck to them, then give them freedom, give them the opportunity to show what they know, because kids are very smart and kids are very resilient, far more smart and resilient than a lot of adults tend to give them credit for. And we were even that, my generation, when we were coming up, but our parents were not interested. I feel like now that we are the parents raising children now, I feel like we understand that because we're not so far removed from our childhood. So we understand. I mean, kids are very smart and resilient, and sometimes you just have to let them figure some shit out for themselves. And then the last one, um, being more authoritative. Where you are that authority figure, you do set those expectations, but at the same time, um, there's no there's no misunderstanding or lack of communication there as to what's expected, and not just what's expected, but what's reasonably feasible, right? Because you can't just expect your kids to know or do shit if you're not going to take the time to teach and instill those things into them. So I'm interested to know what style parenting you guys fit in. Interested to know, one, how many kids you have, boy or girl, and do you agree or not agree because it's not disputable, but if you have a son and a daughter, do you raise them the same or do you raise them differently? Interested to know that. Anyway, want to get into some more parenting shit on the channel. Um, Definitely been planning it for a little while. I'm gonna keep reading articles like I always do, keep seeing what's out there because the landscape of parenting has changed drastically and continues to do so. And I definitely want to stay on top of it. But interested to have your ideas, maybe some stories or whatever about something that your child got into that you handled or thought you handled crazily or didn't handle crazier. And then also a question too. This is a question: do you feel like a parent as far as discipline goes? It's time to discipline your child. It's time to provide that corrective action. And then you feel like you went too far though, right? You feel like you were overboard. Do you go back at that point? Do you address that with your child? Do you have that conversation? Just curious to know. Just want to know, how some of y'all approach this parenting thing because there's really no guide. There's no how to. It's kind of like you figure it out as you go along. And that's another reason why this platform is here, so we can get together and figure out what the fuck we're doing wrong, figure out what we're doing right, and share the wealth. Because if it takes a village and if it takes a community, then the community needs to come together. The village needs to come together. And the village, mind you, looks a little different now than it used to, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but still a village nonetheless. So we can still have these conversations. We can still share these stories with each other. And if no better place to do it, why not right here on the life, relationships, and everything in between platform? I don't pretend to know everything. I just know what I know. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what y'all think about this one. And I'll see you on the next one. Peace and love.